audience. And now it's over to you. So do we have any questions? Any questions? Hands where I can see them. This lady here, then that gentleman. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. There was an article recently that spoke about a Hippocratic Oath, implementing a kind of Hippocratic Oath for scientists or for mathematicians or for computer technologists or software engineering. And I don't know if that is a way forward, especially because I think the sentiment we see is like regulation is near impossible or probably ineffective, which saddens me. I would love there to be some regulation, because at the moment there's none. But what are your thoughts on whether we did implement an equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath where scientists would first do no harm? Would that maybe address the ethical dilemma?
I can say something about that. Firstly, I'm very sceptical of an approach that says that there's no future for regulation in this space. I think there are practical limits that Elijah spoke to in terms of what we can and can't do and at what level we can do them. But I have both an in principle suspicion of that and also a pragmatic suspicion of that, which is that a lot of people have tended to see the ethics conversation as a way of saying, well, just let us do it ourselves, trust us, we'll be fine, we'll just do ethics because regulation's too hard, when actually what they're saying is regulation is too scary. So I think we should be very sceptical about people who say that regulation is doesn't have a place here, because it's really hard to guarantee ethical conduct if there's no blowback for doing the wrong thing. In terms of a Hippocratic Oath, the people who have talked about that, and it's come up a number of times, so Tristan Harris is probably the best example from Silicon Valley, who started the whole time well spent movement, digital detox kind of stuff. What they're trying to speak to is a kind of internalization of these commitments. So there is a general kind of point in moral psychology, which is that the only time at which you will actually be motivated by a norm or a value is when it's taken from something that's out there and becomes something that is personally motivating for you. And I've seen that, so my background academically was in military ethics. And so some of the questions that I would explore were things like, how do you take the laws of armed conflict and this whole paradigm around, just war theory, which is the existing mode of thinking, and turn it into something that stops people from committing war crimes just after the insurgents have placed an IED that's killed 3 of your buddies? How do you take that stuff and make it lived within people? One of the things that unlocks that is identity, that these moral commitments aren't just things that someone else is holding me to. These are things that I hold myself to, such that I would no longer be me if I did these things. So I think there is power in those kinds of oaths. The question is, what's the content when you're dealing with something as wide-reaching as data science? So do no harm, for example, becomes incredibly complicated, although it's something that, say, Google employees are trying to push towards with the removal of their services from working in the military, or with ICE and things like that. It's not clear to me that that's actually defensible, that we shouldn't have anyone working on data in a military context when there is the potential for that to reduce civilian casualties or something like that. So what does do no harm mean in that context? And the other thing to say is that these oaths are kind of bound to professions, and one of the reasons why they take these oaths is because as a profession you self-regulate as a way to, and in exchange for that power of self-regulation, you act toward the common good, and you set aside your own self-interest to act for the public interest. It's not clear to me how as wide-reaching an industry as kind of data science self-regulates, and what that actually means, or how you could do that in practice. So in principle, good idea, but there are some challenges. Thank you, Matthew. Any contrary points of view from the panel?
Oh, well, I think Matt's right, and I hope I wasn't giving the impression that it's carte blanche and it's the Wild West out there, because, law is the only thing that keeps us entropy. But it's interesting you raised the point, Matt, about ethics in a military sense as well. And I think sometimes, certainly in the more woke sectors of computer science land, there is sometimes this default that we shouldn't go work for, the Pentagon or DARPA or so on. But and so maybe if you took an oath like that, you would feel uncomfortable, for example, working on an update to a nuclear weapon or lethal autonomous robots, for example. But it's not that simple, because, as Matt said, there may be cases where, in theory, and this is hypothetical because I don't think the technology's there yet, but you may have some technology that can, rather than drop a bomb on a village to kill a bad guy, you can actually just kill the one bad guy. Then there's this other challenge of, maybe you do need to do things that you aren't comfortable with in the realities of geopolitics. And so, dare I say it, would you rather live in a world governed for all its imperfections by the USA or by China or Russia? Because if the answer is the USA, then that's predicated on, in part, the military superiority of the USA, which means you may need to be doing some things that are inconsistent with that oath.
So I'm gonna again ask Tiberio and Kashona about this. But I remember the title, Making It Real. So less about the hypotheticals and more about the professional day-to-day, perhaps. Any comments? Go on.
I would just offer a contrarian view. Right, because so why is there such a huge ethical focus in AI, machine learning, data at the moment? Well, it's because it is a profession that has completely relinquished ethics for decades. So any statement that you come out with that is going to try and move that needle on that profession to something that is further from where it has been in its roots. I mean, we look at people like social researchers. They've always had ethics review boards for the kind of where they interact when they're running their models and experimenting on people. There's a long history there from which data scientists can learn from. So I'd encourage these questions to still be asked.
Okay. So part of the work that I do is on trying to train data science and practitioners on how to improve their practice in a way so as to mitigate risks of unintended consequences occurring. Well, there are some very simple things you can do to do great good. A lot of good can be done by just understanding what causes what, and not doing those things that cause harm. For example, I'm originally from Brazil, and quite a few years ago, the national ID had as a standard default setting for organ donation to be, I'm not a donor. Then the government, inspired by modern science or behavioral economics and psychology, decided to change that. Now the default setting is I am a donor. And then if you want to change that, you actually have to say it whenever you're renewing your ID card. Do I need to explain to you what happened? Suddenly there are thousands and thousands of people in Brazil who overnight started to have access to new kidneys, new lungs, and new hearts. Now, very simple but wise decisions can create a lot of good, right? And avoid a lot of harm. And here's one in software engineering and data science that can do a lot of good. You have the standard packages out there for machine learning models. You build a machine learning model and you predict the outcomes of what that model is going to do. All the standard packages having the default settings that the predictions will be the average prediction on the entire population. Right? You can have a beautiful average prediction on the entire population of how will be the success of metric A or metric B or metric C. What if you change that default setting to be, tell me the worst case scenario for this prediction? Tell me what's the worst thing that can happen to the most damaged person as a result of deploying this model. It's trivial to do that in a tool. You just put some mins and some max in your code, and suddenly the default setting that pops up is the worst thing that can happen if you just do what you coded up. You know, if that is actually made visible to a data scientist, and they actually see the harm that they are doing to the most vulnerable people, as, for example, described in Pasiona's description before, according to the definition of that vulnerability, suddenly you wake up, right? You wake up that what you are doing is actually causing this harm here. And things like that can change a lot. It's just about thinking straight and clear about things sometimes, as opposed to just creating a whole new technology.
Okay, thank you. So, there's a question here from this gentleman. Then the questions are coming thick and fast now. We might have to pick up the pace. Okay, so what was your question?
A little while ago, I saw the chief scientist give a talk on some sort of trust mark for AI. And
The Turing stamp.
So is that?
The Turing stamp.
That's what it was. In my naive view, I thought, oh, that sounds really good. What a great idea. But I mean, now listening to you, it seems like that's some sort of impossible goal, maybe. Can I just get your comments, opinions on this whole idea of maybe you would be able to explain it a bit better. The trust mark was around the people or the companies that produce systems, AI and models and these sorts of things, so that the general public could have some degree of trust in the outcomes.
So, short, sharp responses about Alan Fingal's Turing stamp.
That's a very bad idea.
And why?
It's a very bad idea because essentially it gives you a license not to think anymore. And anything that gives you a license to stop thinking is bad.
Do we have any contrarian views? Go on.
I think that the value, what Finkel's trying to get at is to deal with the inherent challenge, which is that users don't understand this technology in the way that the designers and developers do. And a lot of the solutions that have been presented before that are, I would argue, equally bad, in that they've basically been like, we need some kind of data and AI literacy across the entire population, which has not been something that we've presented in any other context. You know, it's not as though I need some kind of immunization kind of literacy in order to understand vaccinations. I just trust the people who are doing it.
Well, we haven't until recently.
Well,
it feels like.
Immunisation is possibly a more vexed example. But in terms of the challenge, though, is that what are you verifying? What are you assuring? And the challenge is, as I said before, that it's not a thing. Ethics is not a thing that you kind of get given and then you hold it very close and it's a fixed thing. In the same way as being an ethical person isn't just a fixed thing that you achieve as some kind of medal and then you get to wear it for the rest of your life. It's something that you are continually cultivating and working on. It's a practice, as Tiberio said. It's open-ended. So, like, my question, what are you stamping? Like, so as a provocation for the industry, sure, let's identify the ways in which it's challenging and use that as a path forward. But it's not clear to me that it's actually crystallizing any of the challenges or opportunities going forward.
Okay, now, hands in the air for more questions, please. Okay, that lady there, that gentleman behind her, probably that gentleman there. So, yes, madam.
Yes, thank you all for your talks, very illuminating. I think it's fair to say that you all had something of a cautionary tale to tell about what ethics isn't and about how hard it is to get it right and about what may and may not be possible or feasible. By the same token, we don't really have the luxury of doing nothing. I think that's probably the worst thing we could possibly do is to do nothing. We need to do something. But we don't have the luxury of sitting around for 10 years, working it out. I think we need some kind of practical interim measures to go forward. So just thoughts on how do we go forward? What are practical measures to take us forward?
The first thing I would say in response to that, and I think it's a very important question, but probably one route to answer that question that would not be very helpful is to say, yes, something needs to be done, and therefore, this is what we are going to come up with. Therefore, we are going to create a particular solution now and commit to it, right? Now, it's not obvious to me that the smartest thing to do is to just give people playbooks here and there, right? I think what is important is to point out what are causes of risk. Causes of risk. And actually, we have a reasonably good understanding of that. And because there's nothing too new under the sun here. People have been using data for a long time. It's just that now this actually makes money, so everyone is talking about it. So I think computer scientists, systems engineers, people who understand about accountability systems, regulators, they do have a lot of what is required to actually attack this question. They just need to sit down together, listen carefully to each other, appreciate that it's a new field and there will be frictions of language both ways. But things need to be done, but can't be rushed. Nothing can be rushed.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Elijah and Passiona to suggest one thing.
One thing.
Elijah. Yes.
Well, okay, a really concrete example is the robo-debt scandal you might have heard of. So this is where there's a data matching process under the Data Matching Act. It's actually been around since 1990. The idea is that they match alleged tax debts to your payments if you're on Austudy or the dole or some other welfare transfer. And if the payments don't match up, the law says that a debt is incurred and you go through a process. A really simple tweak, because I do believe obviously that the government needs to be careful with taxpayers' money, is to ensure that there's transparency in the method. Oftentimes the problem is that as a student you might have earned a few dollars for a few months and the algorithms would extrapolate that to an income over the year, do the same thing with income via tax, and then say that you owe a debt when in actual fact you've only worked for a couple of months. If recipients were provided with details of how the calculation is undertaken, it would enable them to go through existing processes to seek redress for debts that shouldn't have been made.
Okay, good practical example. Passiona.
Oh yeah, I would just encourage that in an age where we see the power of corporations far exceed that of nation states. I would encourage you all as citizens to act out as ethical citizens in the best way you can. There will always be opportunities. So as automated vehicles, for example, get rolled out, those laws will have to get passed. Will they get passed or not? As there's any discrimination laws that you can be vocal about, and there's fair trading laws. So if a company has a list of principles and they're acting inconsistently with those principles, is that misleading and deceptive conduct? Be active. Be active participants. And then as for the RAS machines, I encourage you all to be unpredictable.
All right. Next, okay, that gentleman there, and then yes, we'll have some more questions, sir.
Right. So I have a question from the perspective of say engineers working within enterprise that profit almost entirely off surveillance capitalism. What is a good step forward, or would say something like tech unionization in order to actually be able to support individuals who do choose to take a moral stand as to the actions of their companies. Would that be a wise idea, considering the fact that if we just refuse to do things on the basis of ethics and can't necessarily back up our arguments with GDPR, then it's incredibly difficult to actually change direction within a business, because if one engineer does not do it, another would.
Okay, so there's a question about kind of, I think, almost like technology's collective action.
Well, I mean, that really was the happy story with Google, and it was employees that prevented Google from continuing to work on the weaponization of AI, which has then been debated here tonight. But yeah, there's definitely a role for that. We've seen it work in that scenario. I guess, are you saying, do we need greater legal protections for kind of whistleblower, or do we just need to foster the formation of those kind of communities that can then act together? Yeah, I think it's really valid.
Yes, I think for a variety of reasons, not just because it's going to help to make the technology better, but just because labour rights matter. And we know that the tech industry in a number of spaces is particularly exploitative, like even in like the gaming industry and stuff like that. These are really crappy places to work in a number of ways. And the fact that they are, futuristic and sort of the labour is white collar doesn't mean that those labour rights ought not to exist. What do you do if you're working in something that profits on surveillance capital and you think that surveillance capital is a bad thing?
Effective altruism.
Yeah.
Effective altruism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, you can consider whether it's possible to change the organisation from within. But based on the financial models of a lot of these places, like this is their bread and butter. And unless there's an economic incentive to change, it's going to be really hard for them to pivot. So you've got to ask yourself at a certain point, like, how important is it that I work here? How likely is it that I work somewhere else? At a certain point, like, you need to own the choices that you've made, and you need to be able to wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror and say, yeah, I think I'm making the world a better place. And a lot of the arguments that you'll hear in terms of like, well, I've got to pay rent, are actually not about paying rent. They're actually about, I'm comfortable with the lifestyle that I have now, and I'm not willing to compromise on that. I understand that, I empathise with that, but it doesn't hold up ethically.
So should I stay or should I go? Okay, hands high in the air for more questions. Okay, that gentleman there, that lady there, that gentleman there, and we'll see if we have time for any more. Okay, sir. Actually, can we have the three? You asked for 3 questions, and then we might try and answer them collectively if we can. Sir.
Yeah. So in a world where actually data becomes more global and becomes much more easily shareable, how do we actually navigate through competing national values? So, for instance, some countries actually prefer privacy over their health data, whereas some citizens actually prefer data sharing because for the common good, we know more if we have more data. So how do we navigate through these differences in value preferences?
Okay, great question. Question at the back, that there from that lady.
My question's more about the concept of data rights. Is this a potential outcome of ethical data, or is this a gimmick? And I guess, interestingly enough, from a layperson standpoint, is data rights the way in to talk to the whole of the populace around what they may not realise they're being affected by?
Okay, so that's personal ownership of data and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, and this just gentleman here.
Question particularly for Elijah on the argument you're making was around particularly for RegTech and the use of regulation of AI. As a society, we don't always choose to regulate the tool. We can regulate a gun, or we can regulate the conduct of the gun. So killing someone is regulated in most societies. How the gun may be licensed is regulated. Would your argument be that we only look at trying to regulate the tool, because that's sort of why the blockchain community loves to say it's too hard, but really it's not? Or is your argument that the actual element of licensing or use of the system needs certain degrees of regulation, but you still have to operate in an environment that's conduct regulated?
Okay. Somebody pick a question to answer. So we had the differences between nations, we had data rights, and we had regulating tools versus regulating conduct.
Just on the data rights,
Sure.
consumer data rights, and I think this is a very powerful a way for regulatory intervention to actually do something good as opposed to do something bad, right? Because if you ask the history of economists, one of major concern that economists have with regulation is that there's a lot of unintended consequences of regulation. You have things like regulatory catch-all and so on, right? Because often regulators, they think about the first order effects of regulation, not second or third or higher order effects. Now, data rights is an interesting thing, and transparency regulatory interventions are interesting because they tend to increase competition. They are not trying to solve a problem with a particular direct intervention, but instead they are trying to open up the market so that people actually have the option to ask for other third party to provide the same service that they've been given. I mean, if I'm in a bank and I have a home loan application and it's been denied, well, would it be great if I could actually make that my historical transaction data available to a third party, a new fintech bank that is going to potentially give me that product, right? I mean, it will improve competition also. And there are also arguments against that because there are risks associated with data sharing and so on. I think it's an important concept. I think the jury is still out to understand exactly what the consequences, but it's certainly an important idea. And in this country, there have been important recent moves, especially in open banking area.
Just to tie two together, rights frameworks tend to be very Western frameworks. They don't necessarily tend to have cross-cultural application. And there will be some places where the idea of an individualistic set of rights is actually not applicable, which is your question, which I think is one of the most challenging questions to give rise to. I don't have a hard and fast answer, but I think it's a really interesting question as to how we navigate a kind of globalized data set, but also whether we want to or need to give the national and cultural variation voice. So like the German government, for example, have a set of principles around how autonomous vehicles must operate in Germany. That's going to form a challenge for designers as to when geo-tracking notices that it crosses the border and suddenly its settings change. And that might be something that happens going forward. I think that the open data question, especially when we're dealing with cultural variation, is an unsolved issue, and the entire ethics of open data is something that still needs to be navigated in terms of opportunity cost and what the norms are that govern that space. So I don't have an answer to you, but I think it's a crucial question to look at more.
Okay, and did anybody want to comment on
so I think to answer the question, do you regulate, I suppose, the means or the ends, if you want to boil it right down? I suppose, I mean, I don't know, but I would take inspiration from the law, and I think, so take, for example, you may want to pass a law that says, I don't want to discriminate against someone on the basis of race. So that's in some way a deontic imperative, in the sense that there's a certain type of conduct in a coding sense, that there's a particular form of engineering which you may say this is not permissible. It's not permissible to build a neural network or a machine learning system that does A, B, and C based on protected classes. The fact is, look, how do we do this now? And in some ways, a brain is a neural network, and there are people that will make judgments based on protected attributes where they shouldn't, and we can't see into people's minds. But we have sort of worked out a bit of an answer to that. I mean, the world isn't perfect. There's still racial discrimination. But I think we can look to the law, and in some sense, the law is more consequentialist when it can't be deontic. So when it's too hard, when the blockchain bros say, oh, this is too hard, I don't think that means that it's then carte blanche. I think there are other ways and means to impose regulatory frameworks, and but I just think there may be more consequentialist, as in, look at the ends. We don't really care whether your tool is acting using procedure A or B, because that's too hard to work out. But we can maybe have some criterion of fairness or false positive rate equality or something.
Okay, thank you very much.